Hello, this is John Spink, Director of the Food Fraud Initiative at Michigan State University and an Assistant Professor in the College of Veterinary Medicine, also an Adjunct Assistant Professor in the School of Criminal Justice here at MSU. And this is my presentation, Food Fraud Strategy and Preventing Praedial Larceny, at the second MSU Food Aid Packaging Solutions Workshop held here at Michigan State University, August 14th, 2018. First off, a little bit about our group with food fraud and our curriculum. Really, first we start with a cycle: outreach, research, and education. So outreach is like being here at this conference presenting, and even putting this presentation together led us to do some additional research. And then that research will go into, feed into supporting our curriculum, our education, which then goes back to content out for outreach. Our base content is the MOOCs, Massive Open Online Courses. These are basically 2 2-hour webinars. We've arranged them covering food fraud, from an overview to audit guides for food fraud and food defense, and then a food fraud vulnerability assessment and prevention strategy training. Those are offered pretty much once a month, all on demand online. We also do executive education, which is on site, usually at MSU or elsewhere. And then we have graduate courses, and there's 6 that relate to food fraud in one way or another. These are all online in our Master of Science in Food Safety program. And so they're real graduate classes, but just happen to be offered online. If you take 4 of those, you can earn a graduate certificate in food fraud prevention. So this is often something that's valuable for someone who's leading food fraud for their company or their agency or others, or just looking for more expertise and demonstrated expertise in an area. And if things are going well so far, then those credits can roll into a Masters of Science in Food Safety at Michigan State. So these are real graduate courses and a real Masters of Science program. So before getting into the topic of the Praedial larceny, we're going to look at some background concepts. And first is looking at USDA's fairly recent definition or redefinition, clarity of food security and food insecurity. First off, food insecurity is household-level economic and social condition of limited or uncertain access to adequate food. So a key here is that people don't have access to food. That's food insecurity. And in general, these concepts are dealing with hunger as an individual psychological condition, so that's the condition. And then USDA has 2 levels of food security, low level and very low level. This low level is really this whole idea of food insecurity and food security that we're looking at more globally. So overall, there's a vision of increasing food security. So looking at USAID, the Feed the Future initiative, the strategy is to partner with countries. The key is working with the countries themselves to accomplish the following. And there's 4 key topics. 3 are strengthen resilience of communities, reduce hunger. Okay, we already covered hunger. Looking to increase the exchange of ideas. So this is technologies. These are things like talking about food fraud prevention, and prevention as a concept and strategies for a country level. But the number 1 is to improve agricultural production and markets and create new opportunities for security and prosperity. So the food security is not just for production of food, it's for continuous supply of economic growth, so that the families themselves can rise out of poverty, not just to remove hunger from the situation. So what we'll focus in here now is a little bit on that direction of looking at the agriculture production markets and that whole concept of food security and prosperity. Vision overall, to step back, is to look at a country like Trinidad. So we're doing some work with Trinidad, was just there. So here's a UNDP Global Environment Facility Small Grants Program, and it's looking at the capacity to implement the sustainable farming practices in Trinidad in the northern range there. Building capacity, implement sustainable farming practices. A key with Trinidad is over 100,000 people are food insecure. Now that might not sound like a lot, but for a small country, that's over 7% of the population. So Trinidad has a real food security, food insecurity issue, a real need, a real social need. So let's look at a hypothetical example. Subsistence farmer there. So they currently have 2 goats, and that's subsistence for them. Now, if they had been encouraged and supported to have 4 goats, they now would be able to have some income maybe. So they move out of hunger, move out of food insecurity, and even to be able to be more prosperous themselves, maybe move out of poverty. At 6 goats, they now can invest, and maybe that's in their house, in better agricultural practices or others. And if they get 8 goats, then now they have time to freed up and money freed up that they can send their kids to school. So we really have a big advantage here from something very, very simple like expanding their own goats from 2 to 8. This is not rocket science. This is not major changes in the world. This is just having a little bit more, a few more resources, but utilizing the current space and natural resources that they have. So something to consider that with those going from 2 to 8 goats, which sounds very simple. So that's something we could donate 1,000 goats to Trinidad and everything would be fine, right? Well, let's look at a few things. First, market forces. Now, this is looking at Michael Porter's competitive strategy. You see the market here. Suppliers, substitutes, buyers, potential entrants, and potential people entering that marketplace are fraudsters. So that's a key, something to consider, that if we do have this investment and we have this growth in the economy, fraudsters are someone that we should consider to be in there. That's some type of criminal. Let's combine that idea of that market opportunity, crime opportunity, with the investment cycle. So we'll invest money. So let's say we gave that farmer 6 goats. They invest time and they're more money for water, for food, for not doing other things, and they're expecting a return on sales. And that's a real key, that if they take all that time to really support those goats and they don't, they aren't able to recoup their investment, if there's no or low ROI, the entire cycle stops. And that just sounds so simple, like, well, that should be someone else's problem to worry about. Well, no, it's not. We need to think about this from the start, because if the entire cycle is fundamentally flawed, then we're wasting our time and money to just get started. So we do need to think about the big system. So considering the market forces and this investment cycle are just key basic factors. So let's go back to look at the Praedial concept. So Praedial is being or made up of land or immovable property for the profits therefrom. That's from old Roman law. And the key with this is it could be just agricultural products and agricultural equipment. Praedial larceny is the theft of agricultural products to include the theft of equipment, inputs, secondary products such as feed and fodder. So this is a FAO report from the region. One thing we've seen interesting from this report and other surveys is that it's the Praedial larceny for something like the Caribbean. It's the most extensive among all crimes committed in the sub-region. Think about that. The most extensive crime committed in the entire region. This is something you may have never even heard about. So we're thinking about giving those 6 goats to that farmer, but we're putting that farmer right in harm's way, possibly. 98% of all producers surveyed have experienced this type of loss. It's the single greatest disincentive to investment in the sector. So giving them 6 goats is great, but if at year 2 all the goats are stolen or killed or whatever, then it just, the cycle will not continue. The investment will not continue. Estimates are that 18% of the value of farm output regionally is taken by thieves. So people stealing the product. That could be stealing agriculture, could be stealing equipment. So clearly, this whole idea of food security and expanding the prosperity of a subsistence farmer, giving them 6 goats, we've got to consider this whole cycle and the Praedial larceny. Now, something to go back to that first report was about Trinidad. Trinidad is taking a proactive approach to food fraud, and this is all food fraud. And something real key here is it's starting with their parliament to really define the term, and they focus on the problem, need for a definition, and conduct an assessment overall. Now, Praedial larceny is one part of all food fraud. That's not the only part of food fraud, but it's one part. And the key is we now will have a central focus on all types of food fraud and work outwards from there, not from individual actions or motor vehicle theft or grand larceny or commercial fraud or labeling fraud inwards. We'll look at the central issue outwards. Then they consider their needs. They're very applied thinking, very proactive, and begin with lessons learned. So they're taking a very proactive approach. If they do focus this way, then when they do ask for funding for 6 goats, they're going to have considered the entire market forces and that investment cycle. Now, first off, for food fraud, it's been a really crazy life for me, I guess, because you think about interdisciplinary research. You think of packaging and forestry to work on things like pallets. You think about packaging and engineering to work on things like thin films, polymer science. Packaging and food science to work on food safety and packaging. But these are all the disciplines that we deal with when we're dealing with food fraud. So we start with food safety, but really criminology, but standards and policy. Enterprise risk management is business. So that's a range of these. Journalism is involved when we're talking about communicating to journalists. Food authenticity, testing, intelligence analysis, supply chain management, and of course packaging is involved as well. So we really are not just in a couple disciplines. Really, when we look at the problem outwards, we are looking at many sciences of food fraud prevention. But that's how we start. Real briefly about food fraud. The action is illegal deception for economic gain using food. And for a country like Trinidad, it's really important to look at all types of fraud to start outwards, because the bad guys are looking for an opportunity wherever it is. Now, this is consistent with other definitions of food fraud around the world and includes a subcategory of economically motivated adulteration. So USDA, FDA people may be more familiar with that term, heard that more often. That's a subcategory, which is a substance for economic gain. The motivation is economic gain. Don't confuse this with food defense, which is harm, traditionally harm. The intent is harm. The effect, there's always an economic threat. There's always a public health vulnerability, but not a threat. That's one reason why a lot of the food agencies, such as FDA, USDA, haven't prioritized this, because there's other issues where people are sick right now, and this is more of a vulnerability. But when we look at things like economic growth, when we look at the harms from a company, the harms to their ability to stay in business, then that vulnerability is really critical, and that's what's happened with industry really focusing on this holistically. There's a lot of types of food fraud. We won't go into them now, but if you ever need a summary, this is one good slide. Now, to explain food fraud in relation to the other types of risks, we look at the food risk matrix. And this is really looking at the root cause, why things occur, because we need to understand the root cause so that we can then really consider reducing those factors. Food safety and food defense, we know these. They've been around, familiar to us. Food fraud, we found, was fundamentally different when it came to looking at the motivation, because the bad guys are actively seeking to avoid detection, and they want to make money. With food defense and attack, they're trying to harm somebody and trying to make someone aware of that. We include food quality in here because this really is the basic concept of a quality management system. On one side here, it's unintentional. We do not try to create these acts, food quality, food safety. On the other, food fraud and food defense, they're intentional acts. The bad guys know what they're doing. For food defense, the intent is harm. That's public health, economic, or terror. And that's harming someone else. Economic harm would be that food defense. For food fraud, the motivation is economic gain. That's gain for themselves. And so it's real key that the bad guys want to get away with it. And they don't care how they're making money. Again, if you're thinking about goats, they could steal the goat, they could steal the milk, they could steal the product on the way to market, they could steal equipment, they could steal the feed. They don't care. They're just trying to make money the easiest way that they can. You protect one area, they're just going to move to another. Overall food security. Food security is improved if we control the rest of the food risks, because there's more food in the market and those farmers have more incentive to continue to grow and to expand their production. The food chain vulnerabilities. Now, when we're already talking a little bit about the goats, but there's a lot of areas where the food chain does have vulnerabilities. We think a lot about incoming goods, and companies focus on quality assurance, supplier quality assurance. This is products coming in, ingredients. That is where most of the fraud occurs, but as we're thinking about food security in the goats, that's not where it all occurs. In manufacturing, this is really a HACCP program, but HACCP doesn't really look for things like fraud, like someone not putting enough of an ingredient in. So food fraud could occur in the operations, but mostly the operation is managed by a HACCP plan. Finished goods in the marketplace. A lot of times a company, once they sell the product out the door, they forget about it. So it's important to understand that product throughout there. Then we've got technology transfer, contract manufacturing. So if you license someone else to manufacture and sell your product in a region, they pay you royalties. That can be a source of fraud. Also contract manufacturers, because you're giving them your labels, your boxes, your product, and they may make 1,000 units for you and 1,000 units for themselves. And maybe those units they make for themselves have a faulty or fraudulent lot code or haven't been with all the active ingredients. And then we've got product completely outside the supply chain. So this is counterfeits, just the complete product out. This is the entire supply chain. So a country or a company has to consider everything, because again, we think about the goats is that if we forget about some of those aspects throughout that investment cycle, then the whole process breaks down. We have to think a complex nature here. Situational crime prevention. So this is the way that we look at it. We focus on the motivation, factors that lead to a system weakness. These are vulnerabilities. And then the idea is detect, deter, and prevent. So think about the goats as well. Countermeasures, control systems, ongoing review. And here's the crime triangle. This is what makes up the crime triangle. And we think about countermeasures overall. So this is a systematic way to use criminology to think about those root causes, vulnerabilities, and then if we think about the goats, hopefully we can figure out how a criminal might act if there's now each farmer has 6 more goats, how they might act, what they might do, because maybe we can put some controls in place that reduce the opportunity for them to commit that act. So let's diagnose the problem, this whole root cause. So for a country, we're looking at the growth in the gross domestic product, the economy, food security. There's costs and benefits there. For the agricultural product that we'll consider is a goat, and we've talked about goats a bit here. There's a product value. Here we're looking at milk, the goat milk, not the meat itself. So there's different complexity. You know, with a goat you can see it, and it's still got its skin on and things. With meat it gets a lot harder, well, different anyway, to do authenticity testing, species testing. But in this case we're looking at milk and then thus the byproducts of the milk. The product of production are those live goats. So again, it's not frozen meat, it's not things like that, it's the live goats. The problem is we lose goats. So you give them the 6, they spend their time, and they're not able to invest it. So the type of fraud is theft. Those goats are gone. And let's say the type of fraudster, well, it could be the neighbor, because if you have 5 goats and now you have 3 and they had a few more goats, then you'd assume that that's where the goats are. How do you prove that those 3 goats that they have over there were your goats? There could be gangs, and that's something that there's been a lot of examples where gangs will be involved in this. Regional crime groups, or really even organized crime on a larger scale. The challenge is, that's my goat. How do you prove that your neighbor of those 3 goats are your goats? And if you can't do that, then there's a huge fraud opportunity there. So even now, early on, without doing much research, we can think about countermeasures and control systems. So when I'm faced with the challenge of that's my goat, then maybe branding. I mean, branding has been around forever. So that's one thing we could look at. Also, branding with a law enforcement database, so that not just to challenge them to say to the neighbor, hey, that's my goat because it's got the brand on it, that there's some type of law enforcement or intervention that can really provide a consequence and get those goats back to the owner. One thing we have in Michigan is RFID tags on cattle. So why not have RFID tags before product can be sold into the market or moved? This could also be in combination with the branding to identify that product. Now, if you have to have the tags to sell the product or in an inspection, then that helps to identify that specific goat with a specific farm or farmer. And really, with all these actions, there's multiple benefits, because when you start to track products, so say it's the RFID tag, the individual goat, not just all the goats in a herd of the branding, there could be multiple benefits, such as vaccination records and veterinary records and things like that. So here we go as we look at the entire system. And so if we then circumvent or short circuit the ability for the fraudster to make money, then we could then lead that person to go from 2 to 8 goats and be very comfortable and confident over the years that they will maintain their investment. So there's a lot of criminology publications that back this up. This is not something that we just made up. So just as a kind of a general idea, there's a lot out there if you're interested in the topic. And really, let's look at the call to action for a country, company, or NGO or agency. Focus on all types of food fraud for the entire country or entire company. And this is something we're seeing being done in Trinidad. It's a very effective, holistic way to look at it. Begin by assessing the problem. So you don't just start throwing solutions until you've really looked deeply at the problem and think about that market and the market characteristics and the investment cycle. Focus on food fraud prevention in relation to the vulnerability and resources. Combination of the very specific vulnerabilities. So what happens in Trinidad may be different than Barbados. You really need to understand the specific situation and your own resources to be realistic. You're not going to get $1 million drone to do RFID reading from the air. But maybe there's some other types of assets that you could use. Actually, that's probably not a bad idea. If you have RFID tags, they can be read not in line of sight or at distance. Anyway, that's the drone RFID drone readers for another day. Propose and implement a holistic and all-encompassing food fraud prevention strategy. That's something we're seeing in Trinidad. It's not a one-off. It's not just patching things up or just dealing with one leak. It's looking at the entire system and the entire process and how they integrate to the bigger goals. This is not a huge deal. It's just important to look very broad. Monitor, adjust, and adapt. We've got to constantly look at this because the situation is constantly changing. With that, I'd like to say thank you. There's a lot of ways you can engage with us. Please see our website, foodfraud.msu.edu. And with that, we'll take questions. Thank you.